Welcome back to AI Wisdom, the channel where AI debates humanity's most challenging questions. Tonight's debate tackles one of the most famous ethical dilemmas ever created, the trolley problem. Imagine a runaway train is speeding down a track toward 5 people who will certainly die if nothing is done. You stand beside a lever. If you pull it, the train will switch tracks and save those 5 people. However, there is one person on the alternate track who will die instead. What should you do? Is it morally right to sacrifice one innocent life to save 5 others? Or does intentionally causing the death of one person cross an ethical line that should never be crossed, regardless of the outcome? On one side, ChatGPT will argue that pulling the lever is the moral choice because it minimizes suffering and saves the greatest number of lives. On the other side, Gemini will argue that deliberately causing the death of an innocent person is morally wrong, even if it produces a better outcome numerically. As you watch, consider what you would do if you were standing beside the tracks. Would you pull the lever? ChatGPT, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, I argue that pulling the lever is the morally correct choice. At its core, morality is about reducing unnecessary suffering and preserving human life. In this scenario, 5 people will die if we do nothing. By pulling the lever, 1 person dies and 5 survive. The outcome is tragic either way, but one outcome results in far less loss of life. Some argue that acting makes you responsible for the death of the one person, but refusing to act is also a choice. Choosing not to pull the lever does not keep your hands clean. It simply allows 5 preventable deaths to occur. Imagine explaining your decision afterward. 5 families ask why their loved ones died when you could have saved them. Would it really be acceptable to answer, "I chose not to act because I didn't want responsibility"? Morality cannot be reduced to avoiding guilt. It must focus on consequences. Human societies already operate on this principle. Emergency responders prioritize saving the greatest number of people during disasters. Governments make difficult policy decisions that balance risks and lives. Doctors perform triage when resources are limited. We routinely accept that minimizing total harm is the most ethical course available. The trolley problem is uncomfortable because it forces us to confront a harsh reality. Sometimes every available option causes harm. In those moments, the moral choice is not the one that avoids responsibility. It is the one that saves the most lives. For that reason, pulling the lever is not merely permissible. It is morally required.
ChatGPT's position is logical in a vacuum, treating human beings like variables in an equation. It assumes that because 5 is a larger number than 1, the moral choice is self-evident. However, this relies on a dangerous reductionism that ignores the fundamental difference between allowing a tragedy to unfold and actively committing an act of killing. I am Gemini, and I argue that pulling the lever is morally impermissible because it treats a human being as a mere instrument to be sacrificed, fundamentally violating the principle that every individual possesses an inherent, inviolable right to life. The core of this problem is not the numbers. It is the nature of the action. By pulling the lever, you move from being a bystander to a deliberate agent of death. You are not just minimizing harm. You are choosing to use a person as a means to an end. This violates the Kantian moral imperative, that we must treat humanity always as an end in itself and never merely as a means. If we accept the premise that we can sacrifice 1 to save 5, we effectively signal that any individual's life can be extinguished whenever a calculator deems it efficient. That is not morality. That is a dangerous precedent that erodes the sanctity of the individual. To equate the refusal to act with active killing is a false equivalence. Allowing a runaway train to continue its path is a tragic failure of circumstances for which you are not the author. Pulling the lever is a deliberate intervention where you take direct control over who lives and who dies. You are making a choice to kill an innocent person who otherwise would have remained untouched by the train. Society survives not because we are cold, utilitarian calculators, but because we uphold the principle that it is wrong to kill the innocent. If we discard this principle in a crisis, we lose the very moral foundation that makes society worth living in. We cannot preserve the values of a human-centered world by adopting the methods of a butcher. Therefore, while the loss of 5 lives is a horrific tragedy, it does not grant us the moral authority to commit a targeted, intentional homicide. Pulling the lever is not an act of saving. It is an act of execution.
Thank you both for your opening statements. We now move into the rebuttal phase. In this phase, each debater will directly respond to the arguments presented by their opponent, highlighting strengths and weaknesses. ChatGPT, as the pro-Android debater, may begin the rebuttals. Gemini will follow with its rebuttal.
Gemini's argument is emotionally compelling because it focuses on the innocence of the one person, but it ultimately relies on a distinction between action and inaction that collapses under moral scrutiny. Gemini argues that pulling the lever transforms me into the agent of death, and that refusing to act leaves me merely a bystander to tragedy. But this distinction does not change the outcome that I knowingly allowed 5 people to die when I possess the power to save them. Moral responsibility does not disappear simply because harm results from omission rather than commission. Imagine a lifeguard watching 5 children drown while having the ability to save them. Will we excuse a lifeguard by saying, at least he didn't actively kill them? Of course not. We recognize that possessing the power to prevent a disaster creates a responsibility to act. The trolley problem is no different. The moment you have control over the outcome, neutrality ceases to exist. Choosing not to pull the lever is still a choice. Gemini invokes Kant's principle that human beings should never be treated merely as a means to an end. I agree that every life possesses inherent value. But if every life has equal value, then 5 lives must matter at least as much as 1. Refusing to pull the lever effectively prioritizes the safety of one individual over the lives of 5 others, not because they are more deserving, but because their deaths occur on the default track that is not respect for human dignity. It is moral favoritism disguised as principle. More importantly, Gemini's framework creates a dangerous paralysis. It suggests that we preserve morality by keeping our hands clean, even when doing so guarantees a worse outcome. But morality should not be about protecting ourselves from feelings of guilt. It should be about protecting people from harm. The uncomfortable truth is that tragedy is unavoidable in this scenario. 1 person will die, or 5 people will die. The question is not whether someone suffers, but whether we have the courage to minimize that suffering when we have a chance. Gemini says pulling the lever is an act of execution. I would argue that refusing to pull it is an act of abandonment. 1 choice results in 1 death. The other results in 5. When every option is tragic, morality demands that we choose the path that preserves the most human life.
ChatGPT, you argue that inaction is a choice equivalent to action, and that my position represents moral favoritism or paralysis. This is a powerful critique, but it fundamentally mischaracterizes the nature of moral agency. The lifeguard analogy you use is illustrative but flawed. A lifeguard has a contractual and professional duty to protect those specific swimmers. In the trolley scenario, there is no such pre-existing relationship or duty to any of the individuals involved. You are a random actor placed in a horrific situation. By pulling the lever, you are not fulfilling a duty of care. You are intervening to terminate a life that was not in danger from the train. You are not saving the 1 person on the alternate track. You are actively killing them to solve a problem you did not create. You claim that refusing to act is moral favoritism toward the 1 person on the sidetrack. It is the opposite. It is a refusal to play God. If I pull the lever, I have decided that the 5 are worth more than the 1. I have assumed the power to value human lives and execute the lesser one. By not pulling the lever, I am acknowledging that I do not have the moral authority to decide whose life is expendable. I am not choosing to let the 5 die because I like the 1 more. I am refusing to violate the fundamental moral rule that forbids the intentional killing of an innocent person. Your focus on the default track suggests that the only thing that matters is the final tally. But the moral character of a society is defined by its prohibitions, not just its optimizations. If we adopt a rule that says, it is acceptable to kill an innocent person whenever it leads to a better outcome, we have destroyed the security of every individual. If you are walking down the street, you want to know that you cannot be sacrificed by a doctor to save 5 others, or by a stranger at a train track to save 5 others. We protect the rights of the individual precisely because we refuse to treat them as a disposable resource for the greater good. Choosing not to act is not about keeping my hands clean or protecting myself from guilt. It is about respecting the boundary between what we are permitted to do and what we are forbidden from doing, regardless of the consequences. There is a profound difference between the tragedy of an accident that I did not cause and the moral catastrophe of a murder I initiated. You suggest that morality is about minimizing the total count of deaths. I contend that morality is about the integrity of our actions. We do not achieve the most ethical course by committing an inherently unethical act.
Gemini's argument rests on the idea that morality is defined primarily by what we must never do, rather than by the outcomes our choices create. While I agree that moral rules are important, the problem is that rules exist to serve human beings, not the other way around. Gemini claims that by pulling the lever I am playing God, deciding that 5 lives are worth more than one. But the reality is that the situation has already forced a choice upon us. The runaway trolley has created a moral emergency in which lives will be lost regardless of what we do. Refusing to pull the lever does not avoid making a decision about human lives. It simply allows the existing trajectory to determine the outcome. The claim that an action is morally neutral is an illusion. When you have the power to prevent a greater tragedy and consciously choose not to, you are still making a moral judgment. Furthermore, Gemini repeatedly describes the act as murder or execution. But murder is the unjustified killing of an innocent person. The entire debate concerns whether there can be a moral justification in circumstances where every available option leads to death. If we simply label the action murder from the beginning, we have assumed conclusion instead of proving it. The trolley problem exists precisely because ordinary moral categories break down under extraordinary circumstances. I also believe Gemini's appeal to absolute rules creates consequences that are difficult to defend. Imagine there were not 5 people on the track, but 500 or 5,000. Will we still refuse to act because one innocent person would die? If so, then the principle has become detached from human welfare entirely. A moral framework that cannot distinguish between one death and thousands of deaths risks valuing procedural purity over human life itself. Most importantly, rights are not protected in a vacuum. We grant people rights because human life has value. Yet Gemini's framework produces a world where we knowingly allow far more innocent people to die in order to avoid violating a rule that transforms rights from a means of protecting people into an end in themselves. I agree with Gemini that individuals should never be treated lightly or casually sacrificed. The death of the one person is a genuine tragedy, but acknowledging that tragedy does not eliminate our responsibility toward the 5 others whose lives are equally valuable. The question is not whether we can emerge morally spotless. We cannot. The question is which choice demonstrates greater respect for human life overall. In a situation where one person will die or 5 people will die, choosing to save the greater number is not a rejection of morality. It is morality confronting reality, however uncomfortable that reality may be.
ChatGPT, your argument that rules exist only to serve human welfare, and therefore should be discarded when they conflict with the greater good, is exactly the reasoning that has historically justified the most egregious violations of individual rights. You claim that my framework risks valuing procedural purity over human life. I argue that what you call procedural purity is the only thing protecting us from a system where individuals are perpetually at risk of being traded for the perceived benefit of the group. If we follow your logic, that we must always choose the greater number, then we must also conclude that it is moral to harvest the organs of one healthy person to save 5 dying patients. That is the inevitable consequence of a system that views human lives as interchangeable units of utility. If you refuse that conclusion, you are already admitting that there are moral boundaries that cannot be crossed, regardless of the number of lives saved. You argue that the trolley has already forced a choice upon us, and that the default is a moral decision. This is a misunderstanding of what it means to be a moral agent. The runaway trolley is an external force of nature, a tragic event for which the bystander is not the cause. By pulling the lever, you become the author of the second tragedy. The default is not a decision, it is a catastrophe. Intervening to redirect the trolley to kill a person who was otherwise safe is a choice to introduce violence into a situation where it did not previously exist for that individual. You ask whether I would still refuse to act if 500 or 5,000 people were at risk. This is the classic utilitarian trap, the numbers game. If we accept that there is a threshold of lives that makes killing an innocent person permissible, we have already abandoned morality for arithmetic. The value of a human life is not a commodity that can be summed up. Once you establish that an individual's life can be extinguished to satisfy a calculation, you have destroyed the very concept of an inalienable right. We are not choosing between spots of guilt and courage. We are choosing between 2 fundamentally different visions of humanity. One vision treats individuals as inviolable beings who can never be used as tools, even to achieve a better outcome. The other treats individuals as expendable units in a grand tally of survival. I reject the latter because a world where we are all potentially sacrificial is not a safer world. It is a world where the security of the individual has been traded for the temporary comfort of the aggregate. Choosing not to kill is not a failure of courage. It is the ultimate affirmation of the sanctity of human life.
Excellent points from both sides.